My son raised the sledgehammer, and for a moment our eyes met through the glass. He didn't look angry. He looked finished with me. I stood just a step back from the door, close enough that I could see the faint line above his eyebrow where he used to split his skin as a child, close enough that he could probably see my outline, blurred by the old frosted pane. I did not speak. I did not move. I remember noticing how my hand rested calmly on the latch, as if this were an ordinary afternoon and not the moment my own child decided force was easier than words. The hammer hovered in the air, heavy and patient, and in that pause, something inside me accepted that whatever we were to each other had already changed. The house was very quiet behind me, too quiet for a place that had once carried a family. The clock in the kitchen ticked with its usual stubborn rhythm, each second arriving on time, unconcerned with what stood on the porch. I could smell the soup I had left warming, onions and salt, a smell that belonged to comfort, not confrontation. It felt almost inappropriate, like wearing soft slippers to a funeral. I wondered briefly if the neighbors could hear this, if anyone was standing at a window pretending not to watch. Then the hammer struck again, not hard enough to break through, just enough to remind me that they were serious. I thought of my son as a boy, small hands wrapped around my fingers when we crossed the street, his steps uneven, his trust complete. I had taught him how to knock properly, how to wait, how to respect a closed door. Those lessons felt very far away now, like stories told about another woman's life. Outside, I heard my daughter-in-law's voice, sharp and controlled, telling him where to aim. She had always been efficient. Even on the day I first met her, she had spoken as if time was something she owned. I had smiled then, unsure of my place, already practicing the habit of stepping aside. I leaned my shoulder lightly against the wall, not for support but for grounding. The paint there was chipped from where furniture had brushed past over the years. I had never bothered to repaint it. It seemed unnecessary, like fixing a wrinkle no one else noticed. My body felt steady, almost distant, as if I were observing myself from across the room. I wondered if this was what endurance felt like after a lifetime of small adjustments. Not bravery, not fear, just a quiet readiness to see things through. They had not called before coming. That detail lingered with me more than the hammer. A call would have meant there was still something to discuss, some space left for misunderstanding or explanation. This visit had skipped that part. I realized then that I did not know exactly why they were here, only that they believed they had the right to be. The certainty in that belief pressed against the door harder than the metal ever could. I had felt that certainty before, in subtler ways, in conversations that ended too quickly, in invitations that never came, in decisions made without my voice, but about my life. The hammer paused again. My son shifted his weight, impatient. He had always hated waiting. Even as a child, he would rush ahead, confident the world would adjust to his pace. I had adjusted for decades. I had smoothed his path, softened his falls, told myself that this was what love looked like when you were a mother. Watching him now, shoulders square, jaw tight, I understood that love had quietly changed its shape, and I had not noticed until it became something unrecognizable. I placed my palm flat against the door, feeling the vibration of the last strike fade into the wood. The door was older than my son, older than my marriage, older than many of the choices that had led me here. It had been opened for birthdays, for school mornings, for long nights when he came home late and I pretended not to worry. It had never been treated like an obstacle before. The thought made my chest tighten, not painfully, but with a sense of finality. Doors, I realized, were only symbols until someone decided to break them. I did not know what they expected to see when it finally opened. An apology, perhaps, a confrontation, maybe just an empty house that would make this easier. I wondered what expression my face would carry when they saw me. Would it disappoint them if I looked calm? Would it anger them if I did not plead? I felt a strange responsibility to meet the moment correctly, as if there were rules I had missed. Somewhere in the back of my mind, a practical thought surfaced about the lock, about whether it would hold much longer. It seemed important to notice these things, to stay present. The hammer rose again, higher this time. I inhaled slowly, the way I had learned to do when pain threatened to rush in too fast. I did not open the door yet, not because I was afraid of what stood outside, but because I needed one more second to understand what this moment was asking of me. Whatever they had come to take, whatever they believed this house contained, I sensed that once the door opened, there would be no way to close it again. I opened the door before the next strike could land, not quickly, not with any sense of drama, but with the careful motion of someone who did not want to startle herself. The hinges groaned in a familiar way, and that small sound seemed to confuse them more than if I had shouted. The hammer stopped mid-air. My son's arm froze, suspended between intention and consequence. For a moment, no one spoke. We simply stood there, the three of us, bound together by a history that suddenly felt heavier than the tool in his hands. He looked at me the way people look at furniture they thought would be gone by now, not hostile, not surprised, just mildly inconvenienced. My daughter-in-law lowered her gaze first, though I could tell it was not out of respect. It was calculation. She took in the hallway behind me, the narrowness of it, the coat rack with only one jacket hanging. Her eyes moved quickly, inventorying what little there was to see. I stepped aside without being asked. Old habits have their own gravity, but neither of them moved right away. My son cleared his throat. "We thought you weren't home," he said. His voice sounded thinner than I remembered, as if it had been stretched too often. I nodded once, not because I agreed, but because nodding required less energy than correcting him. I could have asked why they thought that. I could have asked why they came with a sledgehammer instead of a key or a conversation. The question sat neatly in my chest, orderly and unused. I had learned that questions did not always want answers. Sometimes they only wanted rest. They stepped inside without waiting for permission. The hammer brushed against the doorframe, leaving a small mark in the wood. I noticed it the way you notice a bruise later, detached and curious. My daughter-in-law wrinkled her nose slightly, though there was nothing wrong with the air. The house smelled like soup and old paper, and the faint medicinal scent of the cream I rubbed into my knees at night. It smelled like a life that continued even when no one was watching. That seemed to unsettle her. "You didn't answer your phone," she said, as if this explained everything. I told her I hadn't heard it. This was true. I often left it in the bedroom now. The ringing startled me these days, and the silence afterward felt kinder. My son glanced at her, then back at me. His eyes slid past my face, searching the walls, the floor, as if expecting to find something hidden there. I wondered when he had stopped seeing me and started seeing only what he needed. We stood in the living room, a space that had been rearranged many times over the years, but always returned to its simplest form. 2 chairs, a small table, the lamp by the window that cast a warm, forgiving light in the evenings. My daughter-in-law did not sit. She never did. Sitting suggested patience. She clasped her hands instead and smiled a tight, practiced smile. "We need to talk about the house," she said. "Not about me, about the house." I felt a small, private ache at the precision of that choice. My son nodded along, relieved to let her lead. He had always preferred that, even as a child, happy to follow someone else's certainty. I watched him as he listened, his shoulders gradually relaxing, as if being told what to do was a comfort. The hammer leaned against the wall now, its presence both absurd and ominous. I thought briefly of asking him to move it, but decided against it. Let it stay, I told myself. Let everything be seen. They spoke for a while. I did not interrupt. I let their words pass over me like weather. There were phrases about responsibility, about practicality, about what made sense at this stage. They spoke as if stages were fixed things, neatly labeled and universally agreed upon. I noticed how often they said we and how rarely they said my name. When they did use it, it sounded formal, like something printed on an envelope. At some point, my daughter-in-law gestured toward the window. "This place is too much for you," she said, not unkindly, but firmly, the way one speaks to someone who cannot be trusted with sharp objects. "Stairs, maintenance, bills, it's not realistic anymore." I looked at the window, at the familiar view of the fence and the tree whose leaves I swept every autumn. Too much. The phrase echoed softly. I thought of all the things I had carried without complaint and wondered when my life had become an inconvenience. My son shifted his weight again. "We're just trying to help," he said, his eyes still not meeting mine. Help was a word I had learned to examine closely. It often arrived carrying expectations, sometimes demands. I asked him quietly if he wanted some soup. The question surprised them both. It surprised me, too, but it felt important to anchor the moment in something ordinary, something human. My daughter-in-law declined immediately. My son hesitated, then shook his head. I sat down then, slowly, deliberately, feeling the chair welcome me with its familiar creak. Sitting gave me a vantage point. From there I could see them clearly, standing together near the door they had nearly broken, aligned by purpose, if not by affection. I folded my hands in my lap and waited. I did not know yet what they wanted exactly, only that they believed this visit would end with something resolved in their favor. The certainty of that belief hummed in the room, unresolved, expectant, waiting for me to respond. They did not stay long after that. The urgency that had carried them to my door with a sledgehammer seemed to fade once they realized I was not going to argue or collapse. My daughter-in-law checked her watch twice, each glance deliberate, as if reminding herself that time still moved forward even here. My son avoided my eyes when they finally turned to leave. He picked up the hammer, hesitated, then leaned it back against the wall as though placing it carefully might undo the fact that it had been raised at all. I did not comment. Some gestures are meant more for the person making them than for the one watching. After they left, the house felt larger, not emptier exactly, but stretched, as if the walls had listened too closely and now needed space to recover. I closed the door and slid the bolt into place. The sound was soft but decisive. I stood there for a moment with my back against the wood, feeling the coolness seep through my sweater. My hands were steady. That surprised me. I had expected shaking or tears or some delayed reaction that would prove I was still capable of being wounded. Instead, there was only a tired clarity, the kind that settles in when something you feared has already happened. I returned to the kitchen and turned off the stove. The soup had thickened. I tasted it, added a little water, adjusted the salt. These small acts felt grounding, like placing stones along a path so I would not lose my way. I ate alone at the table by the window, watching the light change as afternoon leaned toward evening. I wondered if this was how it would be now, if encounters with my son would arrive sharpened and unannounced, leaving marks that did not bleed but lingered all the same. Days passed quietly. No calls came. I did not reach out. Silence, I had learned, could be both punishment and protection. I used it carefully. I went about my routines, swept the porch, watered the plants, sorted through papers I had been meaning to organize for years. It was during one of these afternoons, while I was sitting on the floor surrounded by old envelopes and folders, that I found the invitation. It had been tucked inside a magazine, as if unsure whether it belonged with the rest of my life. The envelope was cream-colored, my name printed neatly on the front. Inside was an invitation to a wedding, my son's wedding. The date was circled lightly in pencil, as if by habit rather than intention. I sat there for a long time holding it, tracing the raised letters with my thumb. I had known they were planning something, of course. People move forward, lives continue. Still, the invitation felt like a fragile bridge extended across a widening distance. I told myself it meant something. I told myself it was an opening. I imagined attending quietly, sitting near the back, smiling when appropriate. I imagined my son seeing me there and feeling, perhaps, a flicker of something familiar. Hope, I realized, does not announce itself loudly. It slips in disguised as reason. I chose a dress I already owned, simple and dark, respectful. I did not buy anything new. It felt important not to overstep, not to arrive carrying expectations that might burden them. The day of the wedding was warm. I arrived early, as I always had, finding a seat before the room filled. The space buzzed with conversation, laughter rising and falling like waves. I folded my hands in my lap and observed. My daughter-in-law moved through the room with ease, radiant and efficient, greeting guests, accepting compliments. My son stood beside her, smiling broadly, comfortable in his role. When he saw me, his smile faltered just slightly, then resumed, thinner. He nodded. That was all. The ceremony was brief. Vows were exchanged. Applause followed. Everyone stood. I stood too, because standing felt expected. Later, at the reception, people gathered in small groups, glasses raised. I stayed near my table, content to watch. It was there, amid the clinking of glasses and the low hum of music, that my daughter-in-law approached me. She smiled again, that practiced smile, and leaned in close, her voice pleasant but firm. "We didn't expect you to come," she said. It was not a question. It was a statement. I nodded. "I received the invitation," I replied. My voice sounded steady, distant, as if it belonged to someone else. She glanced around briefly, then back at me. "This really isn't the time," she continued. "People might get confused." Confused by what, she did not say. By my presence, perhaps. By the reminder that my son had a life before this one. My son joined us then. He looked uncomfortable, trapped between roles. She spoke to him without looking at me. "We talked about this," she said. He sighed, a small sound, and finally met my eyes. "Maybe it's better if you head home," he said quietly. The words landed without force, but they landed all the same. Around us, laughter swelled, oblivious. No one noticed the small evacuation happening at the edge of the room. I stood slowly. I did not argue. There was nothing to argue against. I wished them well. I meant it, or at least I meant the version of well that no longer included me. I walked out past the tables, past the flowers, past the doorway where joy was being carefully curated. Outside, the air felt cooler. I sat in my car for a while before starting the engine, letting the silence settle. That night, back in my house, I placed the invitation on the table and looked at it for a long time. The circled date felt like a quiet joke now. Something inside me shifted then, not breaking, but loosening. I realized that whatever hope I had carried into that room had been misplaced, not because it was foolish, but because it had been offered to people who no longer knew how to hold it. I turned off the light and went to bed, aware that something had ended and something else, still unnamed, had begun to wait. In the days after the wedding, I noticed how easily the world returned to its rhythm without me. The sun rose at its appointed hour, the mail arrived, thin and unremarkable. The neighbor's dog barked each morning as if nothing had shifted. I moved through these days carefully, as though my body were learning a new balance. The humiliation itself did not replay loudly in my mind. It arrived instead in small, quiet moments, when I reached for my phone and remembered there would be no messages, or when I set 2 cups out of habit and then corrected myself without emotion. People I knew mentioned the wedding kindly, assuming I had been part of it in the way mothers are expected to be. I did not correct them. Correcting would have required explanation, and explanation would have required me to frame something that still felt shapeless. I smiled, nodded, said it was a nice day. The truth sat behind my teeth, patient and unspeaking. I learned that there is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being visible but misunderstood, and it weighs more than solitude ever did. One afternoon, a card arrived in the mail. It was a thank you card, embossed and formal. Inside, there was a printed message of gratitude, and below it, my son's name, written quickly, without flourish. There was no personal note, no acknowledgement of the way I had been asked to leave. I held the card between my fingers, feeling its stiffness. I placed it on the table beside the invitation I had never thrown away. They looked alike there, 2 pieces of paper pretending to be enough. That was when the breaking point came, though it did not feel dramatic at the time. There was no sobbing, no raised voice. I simply sat down in the chair by the window and felt something settle heavily into place. It was the understanding that I was no longer part of my son's life in any meaningful way, not because of distance or misunderstanding, but by design. This was not neglect, it was removal. The realization did not hurt sharply. It dulled, it spread. I spent that evening going through old photo albums, not out of nostalgia, but out of curiosity. I wanted to see if I had imagined the closeness I remembered. The photographs were honest. There he was at every age, leaning into me, laughing, sleeping against my shoulder. I traced the edges of the pictures slowly. The woman in those images looked capable, attentive, needed. I did not recognize her anymore. I wondered when usefulness had become a condition rather than a given. After that, something in me grew very quiet. I stopped waiting for the phone to ring. I stopped rehearsing conversations that would never happen. When I swept the porch, I did it thoroughly, not because anyone would notice, but because the motion steadied me. When I ate slowly. When I slept deeply. It felt less like giving up and more like pulling inward, conserving what little remained unclaimed. My son did not contact me, neither did his wife. Weeks passed, then months. When I thought of them, it was without bitterness. Bitterness requires energy, and I had learned to spend mine carefully. Instead, I observed. I noticed patterns in my own life that I had ignored for years. How little space I took up, how often I apologized to no one, how easily I accepted decisions made without me. These realizations arrived gently, but they stayed. One morning, I received a message from my daughter-in-law. It was brief and polite. She wrote about logistics, about paperwork, about things that needed to be sorted out sooner rather than later. There was no greeting, no inquiry into my health. I read it twice, then set the phone down. The wording was careful, legal in its restraint. I felt a familiar tightening in my chest, but it did not escalate. I told myself I would respond when I was ready. Readiness, I was learning, could be defined on my terms now. I began to gather documents, not with urgency and not with any particular plan in mind, just gathering. Old folders from the cabinet, deeds, bank statements, letters I had saved because they seemed important at the time. I arranged them neatly on the table, one stack at a time. As I did, I felt a sense of order return. Paper has a way of telling the truth without raising its voice. Dates, signatures, names. They do not argue, they simply exist. At night, I sat in the living room with the lamp on and listened to the house settle. It made small noises, familiar ones. I realized that despite everything, this place had never asked me to leave. It had held me through every version of myself. I placed my hand on the arm of the chair and felt its worn fabric beneath my fingers. Ownership, I thought, is not always about control. Sometimes it is about continuity. The messages from my daughter-in-law continued. measured and increasingly insistent. Each one carried the assumption that compliance was inevitable. I did not reply. Silence had become my most honest response. Not out of spite, but out of clarity. I was no longer willing to fill in the emotional gaps they left behind. If something was to be said, it would need to be said carefully, truthfully, and at the right time. One evening, as I stood at the window watching the streetlights come on, I felt a calm certainty settle over me. It was not relief, it was recognition. I understood that whatever was coming next would not be loud or public or dramatic. It would be handled the way I had learned to handle everything else in my life, quietly, thoroughly, and without asking permission. Somewhere beyond the glass, my son and his wife were moving forward with their assumptions. Inside the house, I stood still, aware that they had not yet seen what I had been patiently preparing to understand. I did not announce any change. From the outside, my life looked the same as it always had. I woke early, I made my tea the way I liked it, I took slow walks when my knees allowed, and shorter ones when they did not. If anyone had been watching closely, they might have noticed that I had stopped looking over my shoulder when I unlocked the door, or that I no longer hesitated before answering the phone. But no one was watching closely. That, too, was part of the quiet truth. I began spending more time at the small desk in the corner of the living room, the one I had used years ago to help my son with his homework. The surface still bore faint marks from pencils pressed too hard. I wiped it clean and laid out the papers I had gathered, not in any particular order at first, just nearby, available. I did not rush myself. I had learned that rushing was how mistakes happened, and mistakes were a luxury I could not afford. Some days I would take out a single document and read it slowly, line by line, even if I had read it before. I paid attention to details I had once skimmed over, names spelled out fully, dates written in careful ink. Other days, I left everything untouched and focused on the ordinary tasks of living, laundry, dishes, the slow rhythm of maintenance. Preparation, I discovered, does not always look like action. Sometimes it looks like patience. My daughter-in-law's messages became more formal. She began attaching documents I did not open right away. I let them sit in my inbox, unread, like unopened letters left on a table. There was a strange power in that choice, not the power of control, but the power of timing. For so long I had responded immediately, eager to smooth things over, to be useful. Now I allowed myself the space to consider whether usefulness was still something I owed. I noticed that my body felt different, lighter perhaps, or more aligned. The constant low-level tension I had carried for years had loosened. I slept without waking in the middle of the night to replay conversations. When I thought of my son, the image that came to mind was no longer the boy or the groom or the man with the hammer, but something quieter, a distance, a boundary I had not known how to draw before. One afternoon, I visited a place I had not been to in a long time. I dressed neatly, not formally, and walked there at my usual pace. The building was cool inside, with chairs arranged in careful rows. I signed my name where I was asked to and waited my turn. The waiting room was silent except for the turning of pages and the soft clearing of throats. I sat with my hands folded and observed the way time passed differently there, more deliberately, as if it respected the weight of decisions being made. When my turn came, I spoke calmly, I asked questions, I listened to the answers. I did not explain more than necessary. The person across from me did not rush me, they did not look surprised. That, more than anything, reassured me. Whatever I was doing, it was not unusual, it was simply overdue. When I left, I carried nothing new in my hands, but something had shifted all the same. Back at home, I placed the kettle on the stove and stood watching it heat. Steam gathered slowly, then escaped. I thought about all the years I had allowed myself to be defined by proximity, by relationship, by what others needed from me. I had mistaken endurance for obligation. That misunderstanding had cost me more than I cared to count. Recognizing it now felt less like regret and more like correction. I received a call from my son one evening. It rang longer than I expected before I answered. His voice was polite, careful, as if we were distant relatives rather than mother and child. He asked how I was. I told him I was fine. He told me they were busy. I said I imagined they were. There was a pause, stretched thin. He mentioned paperwork again, the same word his wife favored. He said it would be easier if we handled things soon. I told him I was taking care of things. The phrase was vague enough to be true and complete enough to end the conversation. He seemed relieved. He did not ask what I meant. That was when I understood how little he wanted to know. He was not interested in the details, only in the outcome he had already decided upon. I wished him well and hung up gently. After that call, I sat for a long time without moving, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I was listening inwardly. There was no anger there, no urge to correct him or demand recognition, just a steady awareness that whatever came next would need to be faced without illusion. I had spent too many years hoping people would become who I needed them to be. Hope, I had learned, was not a strategy. The house continued to be itself. The door remained scarred where the hammer had struck, a shallow dent I chose not to fix. It was a reminder, not of threat, but of clarity. Every time I passed it, I touched the mark lightly, grounding myself in what had already happened. Preparation, I reminded myself, is most effective when it is rooted in reality. At night, I wrote notes to myself on small pieces of paper, not plans, just observations, what felt important, what no longer did. I did not keep these notes. I threw them away after reading them, trusting that what mattered would stay. The act of writing was enough. It steadied my thoughts, gave shape to decisions that did not need to be spoken aloud yet. As the weeks went on, I sensed a gathering momentum, though nothing visible had changed. My daughter-in-law sent one final message, firmer than the rest, setting a date by which she expected a response. I read it once. I did not reply. Instead, I placed my phone face down on the table and turned my attention to the stack of papers at the desk. Not to review them again, but simply to straighten them, aligning the edges carefully. I felt no rush. Whatever they believed was imminent would arrive in its own time. I had done what I needed to do, quietly, thoroughly, and without spectacle. They were moving forward with confidence, unaware of how much that confidence depended on assumptions that had never been tested. I stood at the window as evening fell, watching the light fade from the street, knowing that when the moment came, I would not need to raise my voice or explain myself. I would only need to open the door. The knock came on a Tuesday morning, soft at first, then louder, as if someone wanted to be sure I was truly there. I did not answer right away. I was seated at the table with my tea, watching the steam rise and disappear. The sound did not startle me. I had been expecting something, though not this particular sound at this particular hour. When I did open the door, it was not my son. It was a courier, polite and impatient in the way of people whose schedules do not allow for reflection. He handed me an envelope and asked for a signature. I signed my name slowly, deliberately, feeling the pen press into the paper. Inside, the envelope contained more documents, neatly arranged, stamped, and official. I recognized the tone immediately. It was the same voice my daughter-in-law had adopted in her messages, now given weight and form. Requests framed as necessities, deadlines presented as kindness. I set the papers beside the others and returned to my tea. The liquid had cooled. I drank it anyway. Cold tea has its uses. It teaches you not to flinch. I spent that afternoon walking through the house, room by room, as if seeing it for the first time. I opened drawers I rarely used, touched objects I had forgotten I owned. A chipped bowl from my mother, a stack of letters tied with string. The spare bedroom, empty now, held the faint outline of a bed that had once been there, the carpet lighter where it had shielded the floor. I stood there longer than I intended to, not mourning, just acknowledging. Things leave marks. People do too. I did not feel the urge to preserve everything. That surprised me. For years I had held on tightly, afraid that letting go of objects would somehow loosen my grip on memory. Now I understood that memory did not live in cupboards or closets. It lived in the way my body moved through familiar spaces, in the way I knew where the light fell at certain hours. The house did not need proof of my life in it. It had already absorbed it. Another message arrived that evening, this one from my son. It was shorter than the others. He asked if I had received the documents. He said they were worried about timelines. Worried is a flexible word. It can mean concern or it can mean inconvenience. I read the message once and set the phone down without replying. I did not feel compelled to reassure him. Reassurance had been my habit, not my responsibility. The next day, I went out early. The air was cool, the sky clear in a way that made everything look sharper than usual. I walked to the corner and waited for the bus, sitting on the bench with my hands folded in my lap. When it arrived, I climbed aboard carefully and took a seat near the front. I watched this city pass by, storefronts opening, people beginning their days. It felt good to be moving without being hurried. Where I went did not matter as much as how I went. I spoke when asked, I listened when spoken to. I took notes in my head, not on paper. I noticed how easily assumptions are made when someone appears quiet and agreeable. I did not correct those assumptions. There is value in being underestimated. It gives you room to breathe. When I returned home, the light had shifted. The house welcomed me back with its familiar stillness. I placed my bag on the chair and went to the desk. I opened one of the folders and read through it again, slowly. I was not looking for surprises. I was confirming what I already knew. Certainty, I was learning, is built through repetition. You return to the same facts until they stop feeling abstract and begin to feel solid. That evening, I cooked a simple meal and ate it standing at the counter, not because I was upset, but because I wanted to finish before the light faded completely. Afterward, I washed the dishes and dried them by hand, setting each one carefully in its place. Order has a way of calming the mind. It reminds you that some things respond well to care. As the days passed, the pressure increased, though it remained polite on the surface. Messages arrived closer together. The tone shifted slightly, the words tightening. I did not respond. Silence is often interpreted as weakness. That misconception has its advantages. It allows others to reveal more than they intend. I read everything. I saved nothing. What I needed, I carried with me. One afternoon, I noticed a car parked across the street longer than usual. It was unfamiliar. The driver did not get out. I watched from the window without moving. After a while, the car left. I did not feel alarmed, only confirmed. Assumptions, I reminded myself, were being made on both sides now. I touched the mark on the door again, the shallow dent left by the hammer. The wood around it had darkened slightly, the grain responding to the injury in its own quiet way. I considered fixing it, then decided against it. The mark did not bother me. It told the truth without embellishment. Something had been tested here. Something had held. That night, I slept deeply, without dreams. In the morning, I woke with a sense of readiness that did not feel urgent or anxious, just present. I made my tea and sat at the table, sunlight warming the edge of the cup. I thought about how easily people confuse compliance with agreement. I had been compliant for a long time. Agreement, however, requires consent. Consent, I had learned, could be withdrawn without explanation. The final message arrived just before noon. It was direct, no longer wrapped in courtesy. It stated what they intended to do next if I did not respond. I read it carefully. I placed the phone face down on the table and folded my hands. My pulse remained steady. Whatever they believed they were entitled to, whatever actions they thought inevitable, would soon meet something they had not accounted for. I stood and went to the door, resting my palm briefly against the wood. Outside, the street was quiet, ordinary. Inside, the house held its breath with me. I did not yet know exactly how the next encounter would unfold, only that it would not go the way they expected. Some truths take time to surface. When they do not need force. They only need to be seen. They came back on a Saturday morning. I knew it was them before I reached the door, not by the sound of their voices, but by the weight of their presence on the porch. Some footsteps carry familiarity even when affection is gone. I took my time. I rinsed my cup, set it upside down on the towel, and wiped my hands carefully. When I opened the door, my son stood there with the same sledgehammer, resting now against his leg like an accessory he did not know how to leave behind. My daughter-in-law stood slightly ahead of him, posture straight, papers tucked under her arm. She smiled, thin and resolute. "We need to settle this today," she said. There was no greeting, no pretense. The politeness had been exhausted. I stepped aside and let them in. The hammer scraped lightly against the doorframe again, deepening the old mark. I noticed it and said nothing. We moved into the living room, the same positions instinctively resumed. They stood, I sat. My son looked around as if expecting the furniture to have shifted overnight, as if the house might have loosened its grip on me without his supervision. She placed her folder on the table and opened it with practiced ease. "We've spoken to the bank," she said, watching my face closely. "They're aware of the situation." She slid a document toward me, stopping it just within my reach. "This doesn't need to be difficult." I picked it up and glanced at it briefly, not because I needed to read it, but because it seemed expected. It was filled with language that sounded authoritative if you did not know how to listen carefully. Proposals disguised as conclusions, assumptions written as facts. I placed it back on the table and folded my hands in my lap. "I've already spoken to the bank," I said. The sentence landed quietly, too quietly perhaps. My daughter-in-law blinked once. My son frowned, a small crease forming between his brows. "When?" he asked. "Some time ago," I replied. The truth does not require precision to be effective. She recovered quickly. "Then you know this is the most practical option," she said. "At your age—" "I know exactly what my options are," I interrupted gently. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The interruption itself seemed to unsettle her more than anger would have. "And so does the bank." My son shifted his weight, impatience creeping back in. "Mom," he said, the words sounding almost unfamiliar now, "we're trying to handle this responsibly." I nodded. "So am I." There was a pause. She closed her folder slowly, then reopened it to a different section. "The house is still in your name," she said, as if reminding me of something I had forgotten, "which complicates things." "It clarifies things," I said. She looked at me more closely then, really looked, as if searching for a crack she could widen. "We're talking about equity," she said, "about future planning, about making sure everything is secure." "For whom?" I asked. The question hung in the air. My son opened his mouth, then closed it again. He looked at his wife, waiting. She did not answer directly. "You don't need all this space," she said instead, "and you don't need the responsibility." I leaned back in my chair. Responsibility, I said slowly, is something I've managed for a long time. I reached to the side table and picked up a thin folder of my own. It was unmarked, unimpressive. I placed it on the table between us. My daughter-in-law hesitated before opening it. The hesitation was new. Inside, the documents were arranged simply, no embellishment, no unnecessary pages. She read the first line, then the second. Her jaw tightened. My son leaned closer, trying to follow along. His face changed gradually, confusion giving way to something like alarm. "This isn't right," she said finally. "It is," I replied. The bank confirmed it. She flipped through the pages more quickly now, scanning, recalculating. "This transfer, this date, why wasn't this disclosed?" "It wasn't asked for," I said. My son straightened. "What transfer?" he asked. I looked at him then, really looked. He seemed smaller somehow, not physically, but in presence. "The house," I said, "and the accounts tied to it. They're no longer structured the way you think." She snapped the folder shut. "You can't just do this without consulting us." "I can," I said, "and I did." Her voice sharpened. "We were planning around those assets." I nodded. "I'm aware." The word assets seemed to echo in the room. I watched it settle on my son's shoulders, watched him finally understand the shape of the conversation he had walked into. "What did you do?" he asked quietly. "I made arrangements," I said, "to ensure my home remains my home and that my finances are managed according to my needs." "And after," she pressed, "after you're gone." I met her gaze steadily. "After that," I said, "will be handled exactly as outlined." I tapped the folder lightly, "in writing, with witnesses." She stood abruptly. "This affects us." "Yes," I agreed, "it does." My son looked between us, the hammer forgotten now, leaning uselessly against the wall. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. "You didn't ask," I said. "You assumed." The silence that followed was different from the ones before. It was heavier, more deliberate, the kind of silence that arrives when certainty collapses and there is nothing underneath it yet. My daughter-in-law gathered her papers with stiff movements. "We'll have our lawyer review this," she said. "I expect you will," I replied. They moved toward the door without further argument. At the threshold, my son turned back. His face held something unsettled, something close to fear. "So that's it," he said. I considered the question carefully. "That's the truth," I said. They laughed without another word. I closed the door gently behind them and slid the bolt into place. The sound felt final, not dramatic, just complete. I leaned my forehead briefly against the wood, not in exhaustion, but in acknowledgement. The house was quiet again. I returned to the living room and sat down, the folder still on the table. Nothing had been taken, nothing had been broken, yet something irrevocable had shifted. Outside, their car pulled away. Inside, I sat very still, aware that the consequences of what had just been seen were only beginning to unfold. The quiet that followed their departure did not feel empty. It felt deliberate, as though the house itself had chosen to pause. I remained seated for a long while, not replaying the conversation, not searching for what I might have said differently. There was no need. What had been said plainly, without ornament or apology. That was enough. I listened to the clock in the kitchen mark the minutes, each tick a small affirmation that time was still mine to spend as I wished. Later that afternoon, the phone rang. I let it ring until it stopped. Then it rang again, and again I did not answer. The insistence in the sound no longer carried authority. It was simply noise, arriving without invitation. When the ringing ceased, I stood and opened the window, letting fresh air move through the room. The mark on the door caught the light, the dent casting a shallow shadow. I touched it once, then turned away. Messages followed, first from my son, then from his wife. His was hesitant, uncertain in tone, as though he were feeling his way through a dark room. He wrote that he was confused, that he hadn't known things were so complicated. Hers was sharper, questioning my intentions, implying misunderstandings, suggesting we all sit down and talk this through properly. I read them both carefully, not to respond, but to understand. The words revealed more than they intended. Confusion on his part, control on hers. Neither asked how I felt. I did not reply that day, or the next. The silence stretched, and with it came a new sensation I had not expected. Relief. Not the kind that arrives in a rush, but the kind that settles slowly, like a weight being set down after a long walk. I noticed it in small ways, how easily I breathed, how my shoulders rested without effort, how I slept through the night without waking to old anxieties. When I went out for groceries, I moved through the aisles unhurried, choosing what I wanted rather than what might suit someone else. I spoke to the cashier. I smiled at a child reaching for fruit. The world had not narrowed because of what I had done. If anything, it had widened. The fear that had once accompanied independence had been replaced by something steadier, permission. A week passed before my son called again. This time I answered. His voice was softer, stripped of certainty. He asked if we could meet, just the two of us. I told him no. The word felt unfamiliar on my tongue, but not uncomfortable. There was a pause. He said he didn't understand why things had to be this way. I told him I understood why they had been that way for so long. The difference mattered. He asked if I was angry. I considered the question honestly. No, I said. I'm clear. Clarity, I realized, is often mistaken for coldness by those who benefited from your confusion. He was quiet after that. He said he needed time. I told him to take it. Time, I knew now, was not something I needed to bargain for. After the call, I sat at the desk and sorted through the remaining papers. Some I shredded, others I filed away neatly. The act felt ceremonial, though I did not make it so on purpose. It was simply the closing of a chapter that had been open too long. I did not keep everything, only what was necessary. The rest I let go. The house seemed to respond. Light filled the rooms differently, or perhaps I noticed it more. I rearranged a chair, moved a plant closer to the window. Small changes, but intentional. I was no longer preserving the house for someone else's future. I was living in it for my present. Another message arrived from my daughter-in-law, curt and restrained. She acknowledged the documents, said their lawyer would be in touch. There was no apology, no recognition. I did not expect one. Closure, I had learned, does not always arrive in the form you imagine. Sometimes it arrives as an absence, the absence of pressure, the absence of pretense. When their lawyer's letter came, it was brief, confirming, formal, accepting what had already been established. I read it once and placed it with the others. The matter, it seemed, was settled. The finality of that did not thrill me, it calmed me. That evening I sat on the porch as the sun lowered, the street quiet around me. I watched the shadows lengthen, felt the air cool against my skin. I thought of my son, not with longing, but with a measured sadness. We had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, not because of what I had done, but because of what had been revealed. Relationships, I understood now, are not undone by boundaries. They are undone by the refusal to respect them. As darkness settled, I went inside and locked the door. The sound was familiar, reassuring. I turned off the lights one by one and went to bed, carrying with me a sense of separation that no longer felt like loss. It felt like space. And in that space, I knew there was still one more reckoning to come, not with them, but with myself, waiting quietly to be fully claimed. Time did what it always does when you stop asking it for favors. It passed, not quickly, not kindly, but honestly. Weeks turned into months, and the sharp edges of those days dulled into something manageable. The house settled into a new rhythm, one that did not anticipate footsteps that never came or voices that would not return. I learned its quiet again, not as absence, but as presence, the kind you can rest inside. I did not hear from my son for a long while. When I did, it was through neutral updates passed along by others, information stripped of emotion. I accepted that distance without ceremony. There was no dramatic goodbye, no final argument to revisit in my thoughts. What we had reached was not an ending crafted by anger, but a stopping point shaped by truth. That kind tends to hold. I began to notice how much energy I had spent once managing disappointment, preparing for it, softening it, explaining it away. Without that constant labor, my days felt longer, fuller. I planted herbs along the side of the house where the sun lingered. I repaired a loose board on the porch myself, taking breaks when my hands tired. The small ache afterward felt earned, almost pleasant, proof that my body still responded to effort, not just endurance. I rearranged the spare bedroom into a reading room. The shelves held books I had collected over years but never allowed myself the time to open properly. I read slowly now, sometimes only a few pages at a time, letting the words settle. There was no rush, no one waiting for me to finish so they could speak. In the evenings, I left the lamp on until I was ready to sleep, not because it warded off loneliness, but because I liked the way it softened the corners of the room. Occasionally, I thought about the version of myself who had stood behind the door that morning, listening to the hammer strike wood. She felt distant now, but not forgotten. I did not judge her for what she had tolerated. She had done the best she could with what she understood at the time. Understanding changes. That is not betrayal, it is growth. The mark on the door remained. I never repaired it. Visitors sometimes noticed it and assumed it was from age or weather. I did not correct them. The door opened and closed just fine. It did not need to be flawless to function. Neither did I. There was something comforting in that parallel. Survival, I had learned, does not always look like restoration. Sometimes it looks like acceptance. I received a final message from my son near the end of the year. It was brief, polite. He said he hoped I was well. I replied that I was. That was the truth, unadorned. He did not ask to visit. I did not invite him. We let the exchange remain what it was, a thin acknowledgement across a distance neither of us tried to cross. I felt no urge to reach further. Wanting less had become a kind of freedom. I stopped explaining myself to people who asked. When they wondered aloud why I lived alone, why my family was rarely mentioned, I smiled and said I was content. Contentment, I discovered, unsettles those who rely on struggle to feel justified. That was not my concern. I had spent enough years adjusting myself to fit other people's comfort. On a quiet morning in early spring, I sat at the table with my tea and realized something had lifted completely. Not pain exactly, but the expectation of it. The sense that something might be taken from me at any moment if I was not vigilant. That fear had been constant for so long that its absence felt strange. I welcomed it carefully, the way you welcome silence after noise, trusting it would hold. I did not feel triumphant. There was no satisfaction in having outmaneuvered anyone. What I felt instead was alignment. My life, my space, my decisions no longer contradicted each other. There was a coherence to my days that I had not known before. It did not depend on approval. It did not require witnesses. Sometimes, in the evenings, I sat on the porch and watched the neighborhood settle into night. Lights flicked on, doors closed, lives continued. I was part of that continuity without needing to be central to anyone else's story. That realization did not diminish me, it grounded me. I had spent years being defined by relation. Now I existed by choice. I thought of the house then, not as an asset or a battleground, but a shelter. It had seen every version of me and never demanded justification. It held my history without trapping me in it. I understood that ownership was not about documents or banks or plans made in other people's voices. It was about belonging without permission. On the anniversary of the wedding, I did nothing to mark the day. I did not remember it until evening, and when I did, there was no sting, just recognition. Another marker passed, another season turned. Life had not ended where I once thought it might. It had simply narrowed to something honest. Before bed, I walked through the house and turned off the lights, one by one. I paused at the door, resting my hand against the wood. The dent was still there, unchanged. I felt no need to erase it. It reminded me of the moment everything stopped being theoretical and became real, the moment I chose myself without needing to announce it. I went to bed without rehearsing the past or planning for anyone else's future. Sleep came easily. In the dark, I felt no resentment, no longing, no need to prove anything. Only a steady sense of being where I was meant to be, living a life that finally belonged to me.